Hi, this is Kelly Sadler, and you're watching Politically Unstable. This week, I'm here with Economist at FreedomWorks, Stephen Moore. Stephen, how are you doing?
Hi, Kelly. Great to be with you. I'm doing wonderful.
Great. So we're going to talk about everything about the economy right now. You know that Joe Biden is out there pitching Bidenomomics. He coined the term a few months ago and has been trying to sell how wonderful the economy is doing to the American consumer. But poll after poll shows us that people aren't buying his message. They're very unsatisfied with the way things are going in this country and the way things are going with this economy, especially regarding inflation. Why don't you think, why don't you think this message is resonating with the American consumer?
Well, because people are financially stressed out, Kelly. I mean, you've got a situation where since Biden came into office, prices are up officially about almost 20%, but people's paychecks are only up by about 15%. So people have fallen behind. And to put it really simply, every month that Joe Biden has been president, the American worker on average has gotten poorer. And so by our estimates, the average family is about $2,000 to $3,000 poorer than they were when Trump was president, when you adjust for inflation. And so that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, I got to tell you, Kelly, wherever I go, people will, oftentimes walk up to me, whether it's at the grocery store, at the airport, or wherever, and they'll say, "Why do you keep saying that inflation's only, because the official inflation rate's about 4%?" But most Americans, Kelly, think the inflation rate that they feel themselves to buy their groceries, to pay their gas bill, to pay their mortgage or rent, to pay their utility bill, to buy a airline ticket to travel, those things are up, way more than the official inflation rate. In fact, I just saw a poll today, 40% of Americans don't think that the statistics are real. They're not real for them because their personal financial situation's worse. Incidentally, I mentioned this one of my Washington Times columns recently, but Americans have $1.1 trillion of debt on their credit cards. 1.1 trillion, not billion, trillion. So people are having a hard time paying their bills. And one other thing, Kelly, I think Americans see the massive increase in our national debt, the fact that under Biden, we've borrowed $6 trillion we don't have. Now, look, Republicans and Democrats are responsible for our debt, but Biden has added more money to this debt than any other president in history. And I think Americans realize that there's something structurally wrong with our economy.
So, the third quarter GDP numbers were past expectations,
Yes.
economist expectations, and the White House heralded them as our economy is back on track. It's doing better than ever. It's driven by consumer purchasing and by consumer spending. Can you explain why those numbers are so high? And do you anticipate the fourth quarter being as good in the first quarter going into next year?
Well, look, I just talked about what was going wrong with the economy. What has been going right in the economy is that there are a lot of jobs out there. There's no question about it. The official statistics are 9 million job openings. So that's a very positive thing. And we did see some growth in the economy in the third quarter. Let's not forget, in the first year that Biden was president, we had a recession. So this has been
he didn't want to call it that.
Yeah, he didn't. Well, I'm just using the official, definition of a recession, which is 2 straight quarters of negative growth. And that's what we had, Kelly. So I'm just going by the rule book. Now, it was a mild recession, but the point is that we just haven't seen the economic growth that we need. And, when I talk to people about, business, they're very worried about the higher. Look, let me just give you one example. Look what's happened to interest rates just in the last year or so. Mortgage rates, Kelly, were less than 3% when Trump came to office. Now they're almost 8%. So you want to buy a house, your mortgage payments are going to be double what they were 3 years ago.
Well, there was a recent YouGov poll that came out, and it said that the majority of Americans feel like the economy is actually going to get worse or maybe fall into a recession before Election Day next year. Do you agree with them? Is that sentiment real, or is that just, the past 2 years have been rough, and so people aren't expecting things to get any better?
Well, Kelly, I never root against the American economy, and I would never undercount the importance of our great entrepreneurs, our businessmen and women who, no matter what Washington throws at them, they find a way to make a profit. And, it's one of the greatnesses of America. So I'm not going to say we're headed to recession, and I pray that we're not, because I don't want to see people losing their jobs. I don't want to see people, losing their incomes. But we've made a lot of mistakes. We've made a lot of mistakes in energy policy and border policy and inflation policy, interest rate policy. We run up the debt to levels that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. So it does feel like, they're kind of termites in the basement. We better do something about the termites or the whole structure is going to collapse.
What is the number one thing the Biden administration could do tomorrow to kind of tamp down on the high inflation rates?
A couple of things. Well, I'm going to give you two things. Number one is let's just drill for our energy resources. Yeah. We are so endowed with more energy than any other country in the world. And under Trump, I was proud as an advisor to Trump that, we did become energy dominant country in the world under Trump. And then Biden comes in. And by the way, he told voters he was going to do this. And it's one of the promises that he's fulfilled is that he was going to try to destroy our oil and gas industry. We should be producing about 4 million more barrels a day. Well, that would bring down the price, and it would also stop funding, Russia and Iran and China and other countries. And the other thing, Kelly, I think we just need to take a chainsaw to this budget. We have to find hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of savings. It's out there. There's a $380 billion green energy slush fund. We know there's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that were stolen from the COVID relief money. But you know what? Washington, the politicians don't do anything about it. Let's go after those criminals and get the money back.
Well, I mean, that would take some political will from, Republicans as well. I mean, in, this town, it's really hard once you start raising, the budget to actually cut it back because people get familiar with the level of spending and the entitlements. And it's always a hard thing to take entitlements away. There's not really much of a political will here in Washington, D.C. to do so. But you did talk about, the Green New Deal and his push for that. You had a column on EVs, the electric vehicles. And I'd like you to explain more about that and why the push to electric vehicles and this green energy push ultimately is at, the American workers' detriment.
Yeah. Well, thank you for running that piece. I got a lot of feedback on that piece. And I started the piece by talking about a famous story in the late 1950s. For the older viewers and listeners, they'll understand the story about the Ford Edsel. And this was supposed to be the great new car that Henry Ford had modeled, and it was going to be, they were going to produce hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these new Edsels. Well, nobody ever bothered to ask consumers and car buyers what they thought of the car. Well, they hated it. And instead of, selling hundreds of thousands, they barely bought 10,000. And so they had to, embarrassingly, it was one of the great flops of all time. Well, right now we're living through a very similar situation where the government and the factories are, saying, oh, more and more EVs, and the car buyers are saying we don't want EVs. In fact, there was just a story this morning that now the car companies like Ford and GM are going to have to cut back the price on the EVs and take a big loss because their lots are full of EVs and they can't sell them, Kelly, because how many times do the consumers have to say? And by the way, I'm not against electric vehicles. Yeah. They're fine vehicles for whoever wants to buy them. All I'm telling you is that 80 to 90% of the car buyers are saying, I don't want an EV, I want a gas car.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the engines, which aren't really combustible engines, they're more like batteries. All of that is produced in China. So it's making us more reliant on our adversaries, our global adversaries for production and supply chains. But talk about that, because the CHIPS Act did pass last year for semiconductors, and Biden has he said, there was some supply chain glitches last year that drove up, inflation, caused delays, and, but we've taken care of that now, and there's no more supply chain issues. What can the next president do under maybe a Republican administration to kind of get our supply chain back in order?
Well, number one, you can't sell the American people a product they don't want. Whatever happens, the customer is always right. And one of the problems with what's happening with green energy is, all these companies, the utilities, the car companies like Ford and GM, they're producing the cars government wants them to produce rather than what car buyers want to produce. I think the big story about what's happening in energy right now is there's this fiction going on that says, oh, we're in a big green energy transition. The world is transitioning to green energy. Kelly, no, they're not. It's just a complete lie. In fact, last year, the global energy demand and production of oil and gas was higher than ever before. Does that sound like we're transitioning away from it? Sounds like we're right now transitioning away from green energy because it doesn't work. These green energy companies, I wrote a column on this in the Washington Times last week, are losing more money than ever before. Their stocks are plummeting in value. And so, maybe we should get back to producing all of our energy, or oil or gas or coal. Why aren't we producing more? Why aren't we building new nuclear plants, Kelly? That's a great way to get energy. We can use wind and solar when it's appropriate. If you live in, maybe if you live in Phoenix, Arizona, where there's a lot of sunshine, solar makes a lot of sense. I'm from Chicago. I guarantee you the sun doesn't shine a lot there. You're not going to get a lot of solar power from there. So in other words, why don't we let the free enterprise system and the free market determine what energy we use rather than having politicians choose for us?
I mean, that's absolutely right. It's supply and demand. It's a free market. It's not subsidized by the federal government. They're trying to force us to buy things that we don't want and that are very pricey as well. And giving these car companies subsidies, our taxpayer money, to make it happen, to push it down our throats. But inflation.
Yeah. By the way, can I just interrupt?
Go ahead.
It's amazing. Yeah. The government is basically bribing people. The government is paying people $7,500 to buy an EV. They'll write you a check for $7,500 if you buy an EV, and people still aren't buying them. So that tells you there's something wrong here.
Well, you're in your car. You can't get up and down the East Coast in an EV without stopping multiple times to charge it up, right? You can't drive it long distances, which is part of the problem. Jennifer Granholm, the EPA director, earlier this year, do you remember? She tried to do an EV tour, and she couldn't get from point A to point B without having multiple stops and incidences. So, I mean, it's hilarious in one aspect, but it's also very depressing in another. And the fact that we are spending so much money and investing so much in this technology that, U.S. consumers, American consumers don't want. And it really has a negligible effect on the climate as well, right? Because to produce the batteries that go in these cars is a lot dirtier than, combustible engines, the use of combustible engines. But I want to move on to, we haven't seen this level of inflation with these interest rates so high, since about Jimmy Carter's era. It took him a while, and his administration a while, and Reagan's administration a while, to bring down the interest rates and to get the economy back moving again. How long do you think that we will be in this period of higher interest rates? And is it going to be a prolonged period? Is it 2 to 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it something that you can flip the switch and dial down by just cutting spending?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm a little older than you, Kelly. So I lived through the 1970s, the last time we had the, really high inflation that hit double digits. And, I remember what a horrific time that was for the country. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with our great country that every time you buy something, it's more expensive. And of course, that's why Jimmy Carter lost the election to Ronald Reagan, because people were facing these high prices. And so this does feel like a little bit of a deja vu right now with rising debt, rising prices of everything, and a president who didn't know how to handle it. And so do I have any confidence that Joe Biden is going to handle this? No, I don't. I wish I did. But if we had new leadership, if you bring in a Ron DeSantis or a Donald Trump or a Nikki Haley that's more sensible, yeah, we can get this thing behind us. I mean, we can start to get spending under control. We can get more pro-growth policies, because when you produce more goods and services, guess what? Their prices fall. We need more economic growth, and we need more sensible monetary policy. By the way, I want to make this loud and clear to your listeners and your viewers. I'm against continuing to raise the Fed to continue to raise interest rates. That's not a good way to control inflation. All that does is slow down the economy at a time when we want the economy to grow faster, Kelly. So let's have pro-economic growth policies, produce our energy, reduce taxes on capital investment, help our small businesses, put more people back to work. All these things would have an impact on reducing prices. And, when Reagan came in, within 18 months, he took the inflation rate down from 11% to 4%. So it can come down really quickly.
But I mean, the Fed has to act in conjunction, and you said that. I mean, what do you think the probability of them in their next meeting of raising rates once again?
Well, I don't think there's any look. Raising interest rates is not a good way to control inflation. It's a terrible way to control inflation. You control inflation by getting rid of the national, reducing government spending, and then having pro-growth policies. We want businesses to produce more goods and services, not less. So I think it's all backwards. I've never, I was nominated to be on the Federal Reserve Board. I'd be raising holy hell if I had made it through that process, because I think everything they're doing is wrong right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, President Trump had a strategy. He cut taxes, he cut federal regulations. He spurred our energy development and enticed, oil and gas companies to drill more on federal lands, approved pipelines. All of that has been undone by Biden. Just one last thing, the Biden administration, when it comes to inflation, consistently bring up this isn't a U.S. problem. This is a world problem because of the war in Ukraine, because of the, war in Israel now, in the Middle East being, turned upside down, that these are things that we cannot control. They're geopolitical factors. How true is that?
Well, look, the dollar is the world currency, really. I mean, all the other currencies are pegged to the dollar. So he's right. If our inflation goes up everywhere. In fact, so that's number one. Number two, all those things that you said that Biden is attributing to it, to causing inflation. Guess what? Those things wouldn't have happened if Biden wasn't president. We wouldn't have had, I honestly believe that you wouldn't have Russian tanks in Ukraine right now. I don't think you would have seen the attacks on Israel. Where would the money have come from? I've always said that dismantling American energy, as Biden has done, not only is bad for our economy, but it's bad for our national security and the safety of the world. We've put tens and tens of billions of dollars inadvertently into the hands of our enemies, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's OPEC countries. I mean, we didn't even talk about OPEC when Trump was president because we were producing more oil than anybody else.
Yeah, we didn't need to go to Saudi Arabia and beg them to drill more. We didn't have to go to Venezuela and say, we want more of your dirty crude. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us this week. And to all the viewers, I will be back next week with another episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.